All right, let's see if I can't finish this in another 15 minutes here. I'll give it a shot. I do love talking about the Haitian Revolution, though, so it might take a little bit longer. So, at any rate, we left off talking about in 1791, there started to be these sporadic uprisings by enslaved people in maroon communities up in the north of Saint Domingue. However, it wasn't just an initial violent uprising. What you also had was some people tried to take advantage of the changing legal structures of the French Revolution. And one of these people was a man by the name of Vicente Auge. Auge was a fascinating character. He was the child of a white slave owner, a Grand Blanc, and he'd been granted his freedom at 18. What a wonderful dad he had. And with his freedom, his father also gave him a lump sum of money and basically told him to get out of his hair, and he never wanted to see him again. So Auge couldn't get a he couldn't earn a degree as a lawyer. That wasn't open to him. He wasn't able to go to the normal law schools, but he was a brilliant mind. And so he hired a tutor, and he essentially earned what the equivalent of a law degree would have been. And he was well respected in the free people of color community. And he traveled to France in 1791, and he spoke before the National Assembly. He visited the Jacobins and the Girondins, and he basically made the argument that, look, if the ideals of your revolution really are liberté, égalité, fraternité, liberty, freedom, equality, liberty, freedom, and equality, liberty, brotherhood, and equality, then, slavery is incompatible with those goals. And so he made the argument that the French Revolution should end slavery in Saint Domingue and in all French colonies, which is a logical argument to make. But remember that France was broke, right? They didn't have enough food to go around, they were broke. They needed the money from the colonies. And so essentially what they decided was, even under the leadership of the more liberal wing of the revolution, they decided to kind of compromise on their principles. They said, oh, yeah, liberty, equality, brotherhood for white dudes, not for enslaved people in the colonies. And so Auge returns to Saint-Domingue in 1791 unsuccessful, even though he had been kind of the toast of Paris and its liberal sort of political scene, and people thought he was just brilliant. He was unable to do things the legal way. And so at that point, Auge turns to violence. He has tried to do things the legal way, and he has been rebuffed. So he goes forth and he attempts to unify the slave revolts up in the north, and to rise up against the masters. However, Auge is a brilliant academic mind. He would have been a wonderful lawyer, but he's not a military man. He has no such gifts in terms of strategy. And frankly, he's lacking a lot of heavy armaments, which would have made things easier. And so unfortunately, he was captured by the French, and he was tortured to death after a very, very rigged trial. The trial lasted less than an hour, and he was declared to be a traitor of France, and his severed head was left outside of the National Palace in Saint-Domingue on the iron fence outside of it. It was coated in pitch so that the birds wouldn't eat the whole thing, and his head stayed there for months. That was quite a warning to people, but here's the thing. When you kill a leader of a movement, and you kill him in a way that is very clearly not just, and you kill someone who has tried to go about things the legal, correct way, what you have done is created a martyr. And martyrs are really important for political movements because martyrs have died for a cause, and martyrs can never disappoint anyone ever again because they're dead now. And so what you can do is hold them up and say, if they were alive, they would have done X. Martyrs are really important for rallying people to a cause. So enslaved people who previously to 1791 had been too afraid because they'd seen what had happened to people during the Mackinac Revolt, or they'd heard about it. Now the gloves are off. Now they're looking at somebody who had tried to do things the respectable way and had failed even when they played by all the rules of white society. And so this is Vicente Auge. Auge becomes sort of this early hero of what is going to become the Haitian Revolution. Now, so Auge dies, but with his death, the rebellions in the north take on new ferocity. And in particular, they become coalesced and sort of formalized under the leadership of one formerly enslaved man by the name of Francois Dominique Toussaint Louverture. Now, okay, that's an awful big mouthful. The name that history generally knows him by is Toussaint Louverture. Okay, the last two names there. Toussaint Louverture is kind of think of him as the George Washington of Haiti. He is the figure. It's probably not actually his name. He seems to have had many, many, many names, but this is very common for people who are subject to enslavement because as they were bought and sold, their names are changed on legal documents. But the nom de guerre he uses, the war name that he uses is Toussaint Louverture, so that's what we're going to use. So Toussaint Louverture had gained his freedom through a process called manumission. He had worked and earned pay for work he had done on Sundays, and he was able eventually to purchase his own freedom. He was a rare, brilliant military mind, and he was able to unify the widespread protests and rebellions that had broken out in the northern province into a full-scale war by 1792. Now, Toussaint Louverture was deeply dedicated to the cause of not just eliminating slavery, but also gaining independence for Saint-Domingue. And he was also not just, he wasn't just an idealist, he was deeply practical in how he was going to do this. So what he did was he was going to organize enslaved people and Maroons into a formal army. That is with ranks and strategy, and he drilled people. He made sure that they knew what they were doing, or at least tried to. And Toussaint Louverture was very practical, like I said. He knew what he needed more than anything else was guns and cannons, and he wasn't going to get them from the French. But where he could get it was from the Spanish in Santo Domingo, on the other side of the island. Now, in Santo Domingo, the Spanish used slaves too. But Toussaint Louverture is really practical. He decides he's going to ally himself with the Spanish even though they own slaves. And he's going to take their guns and their cannons, and he's going to gain independence for the enslaved people in Saint-Domingue, and then he'll turn his attention to Santo Domingo. He doesn't particularly care about the principles here. What he wants are the guns. The Spanish give him the guns because they're hoping that Toussaint Louverture will be able to throw off the French, and then the Spanish can move in and seize the rest of the island. So both of the sides here are kind of playing chess against each other. They're both thinking several moves down the line. Now, during this initial phase of the revolution is incredibly violent because as the enslaved people rise up against their masters, they burn the plantations to the ground and they kill many, many of the Grands Blancs who occupy that territory. And one can understand the rage that is involved in those sorts of actions, considering the violence and the sexual assaults and everything that people went through under enslavement. That is an understandable emotional response. It isn't a good military act, however, because it means that you've eliminated the supplies that you could have otherwise had from the houses, from the fields. Now, during this period, the revolutionaries, they start to dress themselves like French revolutionary soldiers. They wear the coquette, the little ribbon of red, white, and blue that looks like the French flag. They call themselves citoyens, sans-culottes. They talk about it as though they are part of the French Revolution because to their minds, they are. Now, the British get involved in this stage of the revolution, which is fascinating because the British and the French don't like each other. But the British say that they're going to Saint-Domingue to go and help out the French and put down what they're calling a slave rebellion. Now, there's a couple of reasons why the British are involved here. Number one, the British are scared to death that this slave rebellion, as they see it right now, is going to result in a wave of rebellions around the Caribbean, particularly in Jamaica, which is not that far from Saint-Domingue, and which has a very large population of enslaved people, and the British just don't want to deal with it. The other thing is that they're kind of secretly hoping that the French will not be able to respond effectively to these attacks, and as a result, The British are kind of hoping that they'll be able to jump in and seize control of Saint-Domingue, just like the Spanish want to. This is what they're hoping. Now, during the next several years, Toussaint Louverture's military becomes a true military with quite a lot of authority. And during 1793 to 1794, during the Reign of Terror, Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety declare that all slavery in all French colonies shall be abolished. Now, they're doing that partially because it's already true, frankly, in Saint-Domingue. Toussaint Louverture, by 1793 and 94, pretty much had control of about 85 to 90% of the island. But the remaining French colonists who still hold slaves refuse to acknowledge the existence of the Committee of Public Safety and their new abolition of slavery. So Toussaint Louverture swaps sides. He no longer flies the Spanish flag, and he decides to align himself with the revolutionary government of France, because now the government of France is saying what he wants them to say. So by 1801, Toussaint Louverture has basically ended the practice of slavery in Saint-Domingue. And he is the de facto leader of an almost entirely free Saint-Domingue. It's only like a few inches from full independence from France. So here is Toussaint Louverture, or at least what we think he looks like. There aren't that many portraits of him. Now, however, in 1801, there's a new person in charge in France, and that is Napoleon. When he becomes the first consul of France in 1799, he repeals the decree that freed all slaves in France and in French-held territories, which technically meant that slavery was reinstated. And this became an absolute mess. Like, how could you determine who was free and who was slave? Because a lot of people had burnt like their manumission papers when the Declaration of Abolition had come down, and so there was no legal documentation anymore about who had been a free person of color and who had been enslaved. So this issue of re-enslavement was a real threat to the communities of free people of color and maroon communities all throughout Saint-Domingue. And in 1802, Napoleon sends in a huge number of troops to try and end the revolt. And he does this because he needs money, because he is going to try to take over all of Western Europe. And he wants that sugar money coming out of Saint-Domingue. Now, for a brief moment in time, the French army does reestablish control over Saint-Domingue. Toussaint Louverture himself is captured, and he's brought back to France in chains, and he dies in a Parisian jail in 1803, largely due to illness and probably torture. His body is buried in France, but his heart now is in Haiti. So if you go to Paris, you will find a grave for Toussaint Louverture, but you will also find one in Haiti. Now, after the death of Toussaint Louverture, the revolution kind of like, for a moment, panics and splinters, and the French temporarily restore control over Saint-Domingue. But the French army loses that control partially because there is an outbreak of a deadly disease called yellow fever. It's mosquito-borne. It is in Spanish known as vomito negro, which you can imagine what it does. Plus, they all died of heat exhaustion because they were wearing wool uniforms in the Caribbean in the middle of the summer. Now, additionally, after the immediate kind of chaos after the capture of Toussaint Louverture, the rebellion reconsolidates itself under Toussaint Louverture's second in command, whose name was Jean-Jacques Dessalines. Dessalines was another brilliant military leader, but not a particularly nice guy. Like, Toussaint Louverture was more of a politician in addition to being a military mind. Dessalines is filled with rage. And so when he defeats the final French forces and takes full control over Saint-Domingue, he expels all people of European ancestry from the island. They are kicked out. They are forced to cede their territory. This is what leads to a huge number of French landowners and their enslaved populations fleeing to New Orleans, which is why you have a strong Haitian connection to New Orleans. And they declare independence on January 1st of 1804. Saint-Domingue is renamed as Haiti, and Dessalines declares himself to be the emperor. And I'm going to stop there for the day, so I hope you had a good day, and I will talk to you tomorrow.